I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. This episode is the second half of my conversation with existential psychologist Clay Routledge. Check out the first half if you haven't already. Clay is one of the world's leading experts on the science of nostalgia. In the first half of our conversation, he shared some of his key research findings. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how nostalgia can be a driver of innovation as well as a spiritual resource. And at the end of our conversation, Clay offers some tips on how to harness the power of nostalgia in your own life. Let's get started. There are a couple of stories in your book that really struck me that I suppose surprised me, that nostalgia is not just related to memories that we cherish. And so the example of, I think there was one with you maybe mowing the lawn when you were a kid, and it wasn't pleasant at the time, but it has nostalgic connotations. And the other one, maybe more drastic, is of this group of folks you interviewed in Southampton, I think, who lived through the Second World War, which sounds like it would have been a horrible experience.
Yeah.
Why does nostalgia feature in both these kinds of negative experiences?
Those are good examples of like how meaning is different than positive affect or, just positive emotions. One of the things that I really enjoyed so I spent a couple of years at the University of Southampton after finishing graduate school, because there was a research team there. This was in UK, just south of London. So there's a research team there that was also starting to do some work on nostalgia, which is what I was doing in grad school. We learned about each other, and they said, hey, when you finish your PhD, come over for a little while and we'll collaborate. And one of the things that was neat there is Southampton is a city on the southern coast of England that 90% of was destroyed during World War II bombings. And at the time when I was over there, which was the early 2000s, there were older British adults that remember those experiences from their childhood. We were going around door to door to collect, to get community data, knocking on doors and asking people, to fill out like these nostalgia questionnaires for us. And one of the things we were doing is having them share a nostalgic memory with us, and we'd have them write it or we'd record it. What's neat about doing research with older people is they tend to be good research participants. They're happy to share their experiences with you. And so they often give very, very rich data. And what surprised us, or I guess I should say what surprised me, was the number of people who shared a memory that we didn't ask them to think about any particular. We just said, you tell us, give us a memory that makes you this. We give them a definition of nostalgia. Nostalgia is defined as a sentimental or wistful longing for the past. Please spend a few minutes writing down a memory that makes you feel nostalgic. And what surprised me is the number of people that talked about the time during the war, during World War II. And there was a lot of tragedy in these narratives. They weren't sugarcoating it. They weren't saying this was an awesome time or this was a fun time. They were saying it was a very difficult time. It was a tragic time. Families were separated. Fathers were sent over to continent to fight war. Kids were separated from their mothers or sent with their grandparents out to the country. So there was all this. But the reason they shared these stories is, in those stories was an appreciation for how events like that remind you of what's important in life, like family, togetherness, like being part of something, and all the sort of things we get distracted by and get worked up about. That kind of fades away when things get bleak like that. And so, there's a lot of nostalgic memories like that, even that aren't as dramatic as like going through a war where your city's being bombed, but that are just, difficult times for me that you felt like have created your character, have, cultivated who you are, that have made you grow personally, that have given you an appreciation for life. So I think it's this meaningful, these are significant memories. Now, doesn't mean every nostalgic memory is like that. Some nostalgic memories are, hey, me and my buddies went on a road trip. Like anything, there can be there's an intent, there's a continuum of some memories are just kind of lighthearted fun, and some are very, very deep. But when you ask people, share a nostalgic memory with you, they often kind of go to something that's really, really important, a cultural rite of passage, an important family event, something that really changed the course of their life, or something like that.
Right, right, right. I suppose would your example of mowing the lawn when you were a kid with your dad would that be sort of maybe a less intense version of something where at the time it was not pleasant, but to
Yeah,
go back to that memory?
absolutely. Yeah. So my dad used to make me go like mow lawns, and I hated it. Like I was just like, this is this is this isn't great.
Yeah.
And I remember having always trying to wash that gasoline smell off of my hands, and it's just like I just smelled like gasoline all the time. And it's weird because I didn't. It was very aversive. And now, if I get that, like even that little hint of like gasoline smell, like it triggers the nostalgia. Like and smell is a powerful sensory input, like that kind of triggers nostalgia. Typically, it's things we want to smell, like food.
Yes. Yeah.
But things that are attached to memories, and the reason I think that kind of stands out as a nostalgic memory is, again, I only came to that, I only started thinking of that as a nostalgic memory after my dad died. And I think what it was is I was looking for experiences I had that my dad taught me something. He was trying to teach me work, as a kid, a lot of teenagers don't work now, actually. But when I, starting from 12 or 13, I had a paper out. My dad made me mow lawns. I mean, he was very much like, this is how you learn, to grow up and be a man is you have to work and you have to be responsible and, save. And so he was trying to teach me all this stuff, like financial responsibility, work ethic. And so at the time I was like, this is, I don't like, it's summer, I'm out of school. I don't want being dragged out of bed early in the morning to go mow lawns. But then I look back on it and I was like, yeah, that was really good. That contributed to sort of my work ethic today. So I think that's where, that's that example of, yes, it was kind of a negative memory, but it was a valuable one. It helped me. And now I can kind of look back and revisit that memory with a new appreciation for, not as traumatic as, surviving a war or anything like that. But, these little life experiences that we think, even if they are unpleasant or difficult, that we think somehow helped us define our sense of self.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about, and after reading your book too, is the relationship between nostalgia and beauty, especially in relation to memory. So when I, the past year, I've been organizing a bunch of events, dinners, and other kinds of conversations, and often we start with the question like the one I posed to you, and people share their experiences of experiences of beauty from their past. And I wonder if would you say that all of those encounters with beauty from our past are nostalgic memories? Because there is an affective component to it. You're recalling something that was it varies on some spectrum of being moderately pleasant to intensely sort of awe-provoking, but often connects to some experience of moral beauty, maybe a grandparent or someone who you recall fondly, some yearning for an experience of being protected, of peace, etc. Would all of those memories of beauty be nostalgic, or how would you see that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that makes sense. And, another way of framing it might be nostalgia is about what makes life beautiful, right? Our nostalgic memories are part of what makes life beautiful. And so we have a bunch of, as I noted, we have a bunch of mundane memories that are, it's not like these are useless memories. It's good to know. It's good, for instance, that I know how to drive to the grocery store and right. What aisle things are on. It's you don't want, it's good to habituate, right? And to be able to know, to have that kind of level of memory. But that's not what really enriches life and adds that layer of color to life. And I think so. Yeah, I think nostalgia memories are beautiful memories. I think that's a good way. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. One of the things I was struck by in your book work, a couple of findings. One, you I think you noted that 80% of people weekly seem to experience nostalgia. But also, I think you noted that people turn to nostalgic memories when they experience negative challenges to their sense of self-continuity. And I wonder if there's any relationship. I mean, do you feel that, or do you see in your research at all that there's any kind of increase? Are people becoming more nostalgic today? Are people struggling more with their sense of continuity? Is that what is provoking this this turn to nostalgia? Is it just a normal human operation that would sort of, you would expect to find this distribution at all times and places, or is there something about our time today that is driving people a bit more in this direction?
I think both are true. For one, it is a normal part of the human experience. And, so you can think of nostalgia as actually having like two classes of triggers. And so a lot of triggers are like what we just call sensory input. So you hear that old song, you see an advertisement. I mean, this is what a lot of marketing, like nostalgic marketing, is about. It's like directly triggering like nostalgic feelings. And so just because we live in a world like full of these types of experiences, especially now, people spend a lot of time online, and it's a lot easier to access nostalgic content and to promote nostalgic content, that the world does seem to be increasingly populated with nostalgic material, which has the input effect of maybe increasing nostalgia. But in addition to those kinds of triggers, there's also what we call internal psychological triggers. And those tend to be experiences of dissatisfaction or distress. So anxiety, loneliness, a lack of meaning, a sense of discontinuity, financial insecurity, anything that's going on in your life that's like distressing to you tends to increase nostalgia. So to your question, it is true that in times of like, broad scale distress, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, nostalgia at the society level increases. So for instance, in Spotify, during the pandemic, people were listening to more music in general, but they were especially listening to older music, to nostalgic music. So nostalgia does increase as a function of when society is going through difficult times. So not surprisingly, I do think we are in a time period where there's a great amount of nostalgia because, there's so much political polarization. There's so much worry about artificial intelligence, social media, how the world is changing. It seems like the faster the world changes, the more we have that discontinuity, the more we feel disconnected, for unstable in some way from who we are and how we've tried to build our lives, which inspires us to like pull from the past and be like, no, okay, I can stabilize myself. I can find some sense of continuity. So I do think it's true that in times that are, perhaps more disruptive, you might say, nostalgia increases. But because our personal life, at the more granular level, everyone's personal lives are going at various points in time are going through different amounts of discontinuity. So in our research, we found, for instance, the more people are experiencing things like job loss, the loss of a loved one, relationship separation, or anything like that in their own lives, nostalgia increases, which helps explain why nostalgia sometimes fluctuates as a function of age. So there are periods, people go through different things at different times, of course, but in general, you could say there are periods in development, like the transition from childhood to adulthood, that are disruptive. You're going away to university, you're moving out of your family home, you're starting a job, like a vocation, you're doing something new where you're not just a kid in your parents' house anymore. Nostalgia tends to go up during that period because you're going through a new experience, and it's like you're pulling from the past as a way to stabilize yourself and to find like that confidence and motivation. Perhaps then you get things sort of figured out, you figure out your career, you partner up, you kind of move through this period of stability. And then nostalgia seems to settle down, and then it starts to go back up again, probably in your like 40s. And so it's like your kids are getting older, you're starting to think about like them, them going away, empty nesting, you're starting to go through midlife. Like if you're me, your vision's getting worse, you're losing your hair, like your life's changing again. And so this is another period of like disruption, and you're like, you're turning to the past for comfort. And of course, as you get older, you start to lose loved ones and so forth. Again, any of these things can happen at any point in your life, but we do see like a small but significant quadratic effect of lifetime nostalgia, where it goes up kind of in young adulthood, kind of settles a little, and then starts to go back up as you get older. That's important because if you just look at a simple correlation, you don't really see a lot. The effect of nostalgia and age is fairly small. And I think it's because it's not linear.
Right.
But again, there's a lot of variability within that, of course, because at any point in time, you can have life can throw you a big challenge and a big hurdle, which might trigger increased nostalgia for you personally. But when you scale out to like this, across the lifespan and across societies, you can kind of see these broader trends of nostalgia, going up or down as a function of, chaos, distress, uncertainty versus stability, and so forth.
Yeah. It seems like around the world, a lot of populist movements, and we're seeing, here in the US as well, with sort of Make America Great Again, but, in other countries as well, seem to be hearkening back to a kind of almost like a golden era where things were better. Do you think that the world is somehow getting maybe more? Is this a reflection of some kind of growing anxiety around the world? Not just in the U.S., but what's happening that's driving movements that seem to want to I guess provoke a sense of nostalgia, or that might be responding to a growing sense of nostalgia around the world? What's happening there?
Yeah. So to be clear, sure, there's a lot of causes for these types of trends, and I'm not a political scientist. I'm sure there's all sorts of other things going on, but I do think that where the nostalgia component comes in, where the psychological component comes in, is yes, you're seeing a lot of societal change and disruption, and that's triggering this sense of who are we? The desire to solidify some sort of societal or national identity of some collective sense of self, and looking backwards. And this is, the tricky part about this type of nostalgia is it's not always healthy, and it can be manipulated in ways. So for instance, I'm not saying politicians are reading our research on nostalgia, but notice how it seems like there's an implicit understanding of this relationship between this distress and nostalgia, because politicians don't come out and say, oh, look how awesome everything is right now. You should, we should go back to the way things were. They try to provoke a sense of anxiety or fear, right? They tell you how, the world's falling apart. And so they manipulate it in that way. Even if things are going relatively well, generally, the goal is to be no, things aren't going well. Vote for me. And then it's they understand that well, things aren't going well. How do we make them better? Well, we look to the past. And there is, there is some wisdom there. I'm not dismissing that, but a lot of times it's done in a sort of prejudiced or unproductive way. And it's not just the right-wing populists. It's you see this on the left too. You see in the environmentalist movement, you see kind of this glamorizing of a past before industrialization. And of course that wasn't, there was mass starvation and disease and all sorts of problems. But you see this on both sides. It's not just a purely right-wing thing. You see it in a lot of kind of left-wing movements too. But again, the idea behind it, if instead of, the way I try to approach it is, instead of just criticizing it, I try to understand, well, what are, maybe they're misguided, but there's something going on here. And I think they're identifying, challenges, and maybe some of these are exaggerated, but they're identifying real problems. They're saying, oh, we are concerned about climate change. We are concerned about, growing violence, or, we are concerned about these different challenges. We are concerned about, the potential for people to lose jobs to machines.
Yeah.
And again, these aren't always rational fears. A lot of times they are, or a lot of times it's a combination of there's something there, but then, they exaggerate. But then I think what's useful is to then say, okay, they're looking for something. They're looking for some guidance. And as I noted before, it's not the case that people really want to go back to the past. What they want is certain elements from the past to influence how we design the future. We're moving forward no matter what. Like we don't actually have time machines. We can't go back. Like we're moving forward in time. That's the only direction we can go. And so what we're saying is the world I want tomorrow, maybe there's something I can borrow from this. And sometimes it's not always, like I said, sometimes it's not always healthy. But I think even in contexts where we might not like historical nostalgia, it's better to recognize that this is a real thing. And then how can you help shape it in a more productive way? Like, I've done a lot of work at the Archbridge Institute and the Human Flourishing Lab on the concept of patriotism. Now, a lot of people, you talk about patriotism and they get a little bit weird. They're like, oh, that's some like far right thing. It's like, no, there's a lot of good evidence in social psychology that's actually really important for people to feel like they're part of a group that's larger than themselves. It promotes cooperation, it promotes collaboration, it helps people, sacrifice like kind of hedonic like goals to do something big, to participate in something bigger than themselves. It increases social trust. There's lots of good reasons to support like a healthy form of patriotism around a shared, some kind of shared national identity. And you can do that in a non-prejudicial way. You can do that in a very productive, healthy way that's not xenophobic, that's not prejudicial. So I think there are ways to recognize, no, people want to be, people want to feel like they're part of a country and they're proud of their country and they belong to something and they're working towards something. Not to mock or dismiss that, no, that's important. But how do we avoid where this goes off the rails, or how do we avoid where this becomes prejudicial or harmful in some way? And so, I think that's like an important way of like addressing some of these concerns that people have about that, like, looking back, the past is better.
Yeah. It also seems like it's worth interrogating the kinds of things we're nostalgic about, right? And because I think it's hard to not smuggle it in. I mean, I'm even thinking of, Marx's writings they're very nostalgic in many ways, and so all these calls for revolution are embedded in some kind of nostalgia for a primitive state of nature that is a kind of fiction, right? And I think scrutinizing some of that can be really helpful to sort of think about, well, is this the kind of future that's realistic or possible or worth desiring? I'm curious though as to what you see as the potential for nostalgia to help us innovate. So is it a driver of innovation then?
I think so. When I was working on that book, I was talking to different artists, filmmakers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and basically all of them have a nostalgic story of what's made them passionate about what they're doing. So you can talk to a filmmaker and they'll talk about the movies that they saw as a kid, and that movie that really is like, I want to do this. And so this, at one basic level, I think nostalgia fuels that passion, that desire to do something. And so that in itself is important. But then if you look at the content on what they're doing, look at somebody who's trying to make like really cutting edge music, trying to do something really different. And, watch interviews with them and they'll talk about, well, I'm trying to do this, but I grew up listening to this and I wanted to give a nod to the, work in these kind of beats or do this kind of, so you'll see people mixing genres from the past, adding a modern element to it, sampling things, like coming up with a new version of it. You see this in fashion, right? A lot of fashion is about like using like new materials, but then doing like some kind of cut or something that's a nod to the past. So I think in the creative spaces where people are trying to do the freshest stuff are extremely nostalgic. If you look at car designs, they're trying to make them as state of the art as possible because people want new technology, they want fuel efficiency, they want electric vehicles, they want everything like hyper connected on there. But it's like there's some kind of aesthetic or something that they're a retro aesthetic or something that they like, or there's some kind of inspiration behind it. So I think nostalgia is definitely a big part of both the like motivational, like the passion kind of component of innovation, and also in terms of getting ideas. Like taking, some of the most innovative ideas are the ones where they've really figured out something that's been done before, and then put a new spin on it, given it a new direction that no one else thought of taking it in. And so I think that's very much part of innovation.
Yeah. Great. That's really it for the questions I had for you, but I'm curious if you might have any tips or recommendations for our listeners about how to harness the positive powers of nostalgia and perhaps also anticipate some of its negative potential, right? Because it seems like it does have the power to both draw us away from others or draw us simply to the past, but also draw us into social connection and towards innovation, towards a healthier self concept, and so on. So what might be ways in which people could leverage its potential?
Yeah. I think what I call intentional nostalgia is, we can all get benefits from just a very like passive nostalgia. You don't have to be like real deep about it. Like, people find it nice just to listen to old music. It pumps them up to, to go to the gym. But intentional nostalgia is what I describe as really trying to like revisit a memory. The more engaging you can make it, the better. So if you want to journal or do some type of creative activity that allows you to really like sit with the memory and reflect on it, and then ask yourself like, why is this memory nostalgic to me? Why do I feel this way about this memory? What challenges or issues am I going through today that this can help me with, and why? So I think that really like that deeper inspection, and then it can help you. It can also help prevent it going in a bad direction, because I think sometimes if you just do kind of a really like glossy version of nostalgic music, oh, things were so much better when before all of this. It's like, now if you sit there for a minute and you really dig into it, you'll be like, oh, okay, like this is why it wasn't necessarily all better. But then you can say, well, but what is it? Like, what was special about the time? And does that have any relevance for today? I think it's an especially helpful way to really get that more intentionality of it is to do it socially. I mean, to conversationally, to talk to people that you shared these memories with. It's great to sit around and talk about old memories. And then you can kind of push each other a little bit in ways to like really unearth like, something that you maybe didn't remember about that. And somebody else might say, actually, I guess you forgot about this part that wasn't so great. Or do you really, you wouldn't give up what you have now for that. So I think that kind of, that conversational nostalgia can be really helpful. But all that being said, I think most of the time, the way we interact with nostalgia isn't this sort of deep reflection, but we just like passively make contact with it. We get that photograph on our desk of our favorite vacation, or even we like, Leslie brought it before, like we create that playlist on our Spotify that we like to have at the gym because it pumps us up or makes us feel youthful and young again. Oftentimes those things are treated as like they're kind of like pointless or they're just silly fun. I think those things are actually pretty useful for helping kind of energize us and inspire us. So it can be really, really good to do a deeper dive into nostalgia, but it's also perfectly fine and healthy and productive just to kind of populate your life with a little bit of nostalgia here and there. I don't know if you have noticed, but behind me, I have this arcade.
I was going to ask you about, this is definitely, yeah.
And it seems
say a bit more. So our listeners may not be able to they'd have to tune in to the YouTube video, but maybe you could just describe a little bit of what the arcade machine is behind you.
So I've got this old arcade machine in my office in the background that you can see on the camera if you watch the video. And it's a Robotron. It's a game. It's an old game. It's like probably no one's heard of it. But I have a friend who goes around and buys old arcades that are like banged up, not working anymore, and then he rehabilitates them. And I asked him, "Why do you do this?" And he said, "Because these were things that brought people a lot of joy, and they're dead. Like they're just been cast aside." And I want to bring them back. Like I want to, I think there's still more joy to be had. So I think that in itself is kind of a cool thing. And then he offered to do this for me. And like a good nostalgia, what it is it's got the old cabinet and the old art and everything, but it's actually a PC in there with a modern LCD screen, and there's hundreds of games on this. So I think that's a good example of like how to make nostalgia like more forward looking. It's just like, yeah, it's got the retro aesthetic and the controls, and and it's kind of fun. It reminds me of arcades from back in the 80s, but it's actually like got a modern PC in it. And I'm kind of surprised, like in some ways, like my wife let me drag that into the house and put that in my office. But I wanted to have some art, in my home office. And I was like, well, why not have like a more interactive art, right? So I don't even really play the thing that much. I turn it on every day when I'm working. It's just in the background. It kind of cycles through different backgrounds of games. I kind of just see it, occasionally look at it. And it's just a nice little like aesthetic flair that I find, someone who does a lot of work in nostalgia, I find useful. And it's not because an arcade machine itself is personally meaningful, but it reminds me of, I used to walk down to the convenience store with my buddies, and we'd put quarters in the arcade and we'd play and we'd hang out. So even nostalgic, it turns out in our research, we find even nostalgic objects, consumer products, things that people tend to think of as superficial or like materialistic, the reason we're so nostalgic for them isn't for them themselves. It's because they're symbolic reminders of who we spent that time with. So like sports memorabilia, things like that, they're cues for what's really about relationships, I think. So even the things that seem like they're the most consumeristic or materialistic often have a deeper story that involves who you engage that activity with.
Yeah. It seems like then, maybe this is my final question, is that there seems to be almost a redemptive quality to nostalgia and to nostalgic objects. Do you see nostalgia as a spiritual resource, perhaps?
Yes. And in fact, there's some, this isn't my research, but there's some research that people who are higher in spirituality are higher in dispositional nostalgia. So all of us are nostalgic at some level. As you noted before, people tend to be nostalgic multiple times a week, in fact. But that does, like a lot, just like everyone has a need to belong, but some people are way more social than others, nostalgia is like that. There is an individual difference component of nostalgia that we refer to as nostalgia proneness. There's a number of things that it's correlated with that makes sense in terms of sociality, because nostalgia is so social. But one of these is spirituality. So people who are more spiritual tend to be more nostalgic. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think nostalgia, because so much of it is about even the example provided of like an ongoing relationship with a deceased. Like there's so many things about cherished memories that are transcendent in some ways, that I think there's a very, very spiritual component to them. Even for people who would maybe not describe it, that don't see themselves as very spiritual, maybe they wouldn't describe it that way. I think it captures some of those same psychological functions. And in addition to that, if you think about nostalgia at a more collective level, a lot of the religious practices and traditions and rites of passage and rituals have this historical nostalgic component that gives us some sense of transcendent, like that I'm part of something that was here before me. I'm getting plugged into it. I'm learning about it. I'm carrying forward these traditions. They will continue when I'm gone. And there's something very powerful about self-continuity that's not just, I want some stable sense of self in my own life, but this broader collective continuity that I want to feel like I'm part of something that was here before me and that will be here after me. And so, yeah, I would definitely say that the spiritual dimension of nostalgia is very much there. And also, I would say very underappreciated, understudied, undervalued, minus like a few studies here and there, like I mentioned, looking at it as a disposition that's correlated with nostalgia.
Yeah, great. Clay, this has been super insightful. I've learned a lot. Anything else you want to add before we close?
No, I don't think so. I think we kind of hit the high points. You had great questions. And yeah, like I always tell people, like it took me, I don't know, 15, I've been studying nostalgia for not quite 25 years, but close. We're approaching that. It probably took me 15 years before I fully realized that nostalgia is, I think, really a future-oriented experience. Yeah, it's about the past, it's about memories, but really it's about how we go forward in our life. And so that kind of flipped a switch in me. That's why I called the book Past Forward. That flipped the switch in my thinking from seeing nostalgia as like a defense mechanism or coping resource that's healthy for us, to seeing it as more than that, as no, like it's a source of inspiration, it's a source of guidance, it's a source of creative energy and motivation. And so when people tell you, oh, nostalgia is like getting stuck in the past, or, looking backwards, it's like, no, nostalgia is about moving forward. And you want to do that. When you want to move forward, you don't want to just do it aimlessly, right? You don't want to just be random, right? You want to move forward with intention and with purpose. And nostalgia is a treasure chest of cherished memories that can help you do that.
Yeah, fantastic. The book is really great. I recommend it. And I loved your exercises too, which I think can guide people to some important self-reflection on nostalgic experiences in their lives. And so we'll put a link in the show notes. Anywhere else you want us to direct listeners and viewers to, so they can learn more about your work? So I recently I joined the Substack world. And so I have a weekly newsletter called Flourishing Friday. And so that you can find, and, I don't just talk about nostalgia, I talk about lots of things related to progress, the psychology of progress, existential psychology, and nostalgia and things like that. Otherwise, you can find all of this, my website is just clayrutledge.com. And my employer is Archbridge Institute, where I do a lot of my research. And, you can find that at humaflourishinglab.org. Great. All right. We'll throw a bunch of those links into the show notes. Thanks, Clay. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Brandon. It's been a joy. All right, folks. That's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.